There are chapters in American history that were never meant to be read aloud. They were filed away in classified archives, buried beneath redacted pages, or simply left out of the textbooks altogether. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Tonight, we walk through 101 of those forgotten, suppressed, and overlooked moments. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented events, exposed through congressional hearings, declassified government files, investigative journalism, and the slow, quiet work of historians who refuse to look away. Some of these facts involve the highest offices in the land. Others involve ordinary people who were never asked for their consent. All of them are part of the full, unvarnished story of the United States. So, settle in. Let your eyes close if they want to, and let the record speak for itself. Section 1. Secret Government Experiments on American Citizens. Behind the halls of federal agencies and military installations, a different kind of war was waged, not against foreign enemies, but against unsuspecting American citizens. What follows are 15 documented programs in which the government experimented on its own people. You see, behind the locked doors of government agencies, a very different kind of war was being waged. It was a war for the ultimate territory, the human mind. It was called Project MKUltra, a covert CIA program that ran for 20 years, from 1953 all the way to 1973. And what was the goal? Well, it was an ambitious, almost sprawling search for the keys to mind control. They used everything: LSD, hypnosis, psychological torture. We're talking about over 150 separate experiments, spread across more than 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, you name it. And when it was all finally exposed, the CIA director at the time, Richard Helms, he ordered most of the records just destroyed. But this obsession, it didn't start with MKUltra. Its predecessor was a program called Project Artichoke, and it explored some pretty dark methods of interrogation, like forced morphine addiction. A memo from 1952, now declassified. It just lays the whole thing bare. It asks point blank, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will? And they actually tried to answer that question. In San Francisco and New York, a sub-project called Operation Midnight Climax took a very direct approach. They set up these CIA-run safe houses, and unsuspecting men were lured there by sex workers. They were then secretly given LSD, while agents watched everything unfold from behind two-way mirrors, just observing as their minds unraveled. But you know, the battleground wasn't always the mind. In other programs, human beings were, well, they were reduced to just biology. They became bodies to be observed, to be manipulated, to be studied, almost always without their knowledge, and always without their consent. For 40 years, think about that, 40 years the U.S. Public Health Service ran the Tuskegee syphilis study. They enrolled 399 black men who had the disease, and they told them they were getting free health care. But they weren't. Instead, they were deliberately left untreated. Why? So researchers could just watch, observe the disease's full devastating progression over a lifetime. And get this, even after penicillin became the standard cure back in 1947, they still withheld the medicine. The study didn't stop until the press exposed it in 1972. And this idea, it was exported. Between 1946 and 1948, American researchers went to Guatemala, and they deliberately infected over 1,300 people with syphilis and gonorrhea. The subjects? Prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients. It was a study in how disease spreads, all done without anyone's consent. And then there was the Willowbrook State School in New York. This was a facility for children with mental disabilities, the most vulnerable people imaginable. Here, researchers deliberately injected over 700 children with the hepatitis virus. They coerced the parents, telling them that the only way their child could get a spot in the overcrowded school was if they consented to the study. the Atomic Energy Commission, they funded their own experiments. In these, at least 18 hospital patients, and yes, some of them were children, were injected with plutonium. They had no idea. The goal was simply to see how the human body absorbs radioactive material. And these experiments, they stayed secret for almost 50 years. Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. Well, it became a personal human laboratory for Dr. Albert Kligman. From the 50s to the 70s, inmates were exposed to dioxin, to radioactive isotopes, to powerful psychoactive drugs. When he first saw the prison population, Kligman reportedly said, "All I saw before me was acres of skin." But the experiments weren't always confined to a single lab, or a prison, or a hospital. Sometimes, the laboratory was an entire city, and the test subjects, they were just the people who happened to live there. Back in the 1950s, the U.S. Army ran something called Operation Large Area Coverage. What they did was spray zinc cadmium sulfide particles all over cities like St. Louis and Minneapolis. The whole point was to simulate how a biological weapon might spread across a city. And the residents? They were never told a thing. In September of 1950, it was the U.S. Navy. They released a cloud of bacteria right over the San Francisco Bay. They called it Operation Sea Spray. And it's estimated that 800,000 residents were exposed. This wasn't just some harmless test, either. Shortly after, a local hospital saw a huge spike in rare pneumonia infections, one of which turned out to be fatal. They have a name for them now: the atomic veterans. During the nuclear tests of the 1950s, around 300,000 U.S. service members were basically used as human sensors. They were ordered to witness atomic blasts up close, sometimes just a few miles from ground zero, all to study the psychological effects of nuclear war. And then, in 1966, millions of commuters in New York City became unknowing test subjects. The U.S. Army released bacteria right into the subway system. They filled light bulbs with microbes, dropped them onto the tracks, and let the moving trains just disperse it all through the tunnels. There was an experiment in 1949 called the Green Run. At the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, they deliberately vented over 7,000 curies of radioactive iodine-131 straight into the atmosphere. The official reason? To test monitoring equipment. But the unofficial result? 4 decades after, the communities downwind suffered from incredibly high rates of thyroid disease and cancer. Between 1960 and 1971, the Department of Defense ran 2 projects, Project 112 and Project Shad. And in these, they secretly tested chemical and biological agents on more than 5,000 U.S. military personnel, right on board their own Navy ships. We're talking about some of the deadliest chemical weapons ever made. Things like VX nerve agent and sarin. And those veterans, they weren't even told they'd been exposed until the year 2000. It wasn't until 1994 that the true scale of all this really started to come into focus. Congressional hearings revealed that between 1944 and 1974, the government had used at least 16,000 of its own citizens as subjects in radiation experiments. And many were chosen specifically because they were vulnerable. People in prison, the terminally ill, the poor. But the government's calculated treatment of its own citizens did not begin in laboratories. It began with the very first people who lived on this land. If you're settling in for the night, now is a good time to subscribe. A new documentary goes up every week, and this is just the first. Section 2. Native American History. The Suppressed Truth. Long before the first federal experiment, there was another kind of erasure. One carried out across centuries, across millions of acres, and against entire civilizations that had existed for millennia. The following facts document the suppressed and overlooked history of Native Americans. In 1492, this was not some empty continent. Far from it. It was home to an estimated 15 million people. A vast, complex world, just teeming with distinct nations, diverse languages, and ancient ways of life. But by 1900, that population had utterly collapsed. It was reduced to just around 237,000 souls. This staggering decline was the direct result of warfare, forced removal, starvation, and epidemic diseases. An entire world had been unmade. Then, in 1830, the stroke of a pen became a weapon. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. It was a bureaucratic decree, really, but one that set in motion the forced relocation of over 60,000 people. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, all torn from the ancestral homelands they had known for centuries. That brutal, forced march westward would earn a name born of its suffering: the Trail of Tears. On that journey, an estimated 15,000 men, women, and children perished. From cold, from hunger, from disease. And the bitterest irony? Their legal challenges had actually been won in the Supreme Court. A victory the president simply ignored. For more than a century, the U.S. government ran the Indian boarding school system. Over 100,000 native children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to these institutions. Their purpose was brutally simple: to erase their culture. Kill the Indian, save the man. That wasn't just some saying. That was the official motto, the stated goal of the system's architect, Captain Richard Henry Pratt. This was a war waged not on a battlefield, but in the minds and souls of children. Generations later, the accounting finally began. A 2022 Department of the Interior investigation started to uncover the staggering human cost. It identified over 500 student deaths across just a fraction of the school burial sites. The full number? Well, the full number remains unknown. You see, the assault wasn't just cultural. It was physical. It was legal. It was absolute. It was a war waged on all fronts, against the body, the land, and the future itself. In 1864, at Sand Creek, Colorado, U.S. troops slaughtered up to 200 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho people, most of them women and children. Then, in 1890, at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the 7th Cavalry killed nearly 300 Lakota. For that, 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor. And in 1887, the war on identity just continued through legislation. The Dawes Act was specifically designed to dismantle the very idea of the tribe. It broke apart communal lands, the heart of indigenous identity, and carved them into small individual parcels, opening up all the rest for settlement. The result was the transfer of about 90 million acres of indigenous land. That's nearly 2/3 of all tribal holdings handed over to white settlers and the federal government. In the 20th century, the war turned inward, against the very bodies of Native women. Between the 1960s and 70s, the Indian Health Service, a government agency, sterilized an estimated 25 to 50% of all Native American women of childbearing age. Many of them had no idea what was being done, many without their informed consent. The intent wasn't always hidden in bureaucracy. In 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett openly declared, quote, a war of extermination against the state's native peoples, even funding militia campaigns that killed thousands. In 1864, another forced march scarred the land. This one is known as the Long Walk of the Navajo. About 8,500 dying people were driven over 300 brutal miles from their homeland to a reservation. Over 2,000 would perish, either on the journey itself or during the 4 years of captivity that followed. As the frontier closed, the weapons began to change from rifles to legislation. But the goal remained exactly the same: erasure by pen. With just the stroke of a pen, sovereignty could be erased. The federal termination policy, starting in 1953, stripped over 100 tribes of their legal status. This just followed a long legacy from the Civilization Fund Act of 1819 that laid the groundwork for those boarding schools, to projects like the Grand Coulee Dam, which simply flooded ancestral lands, displacing thousands, who then waited more than half a century for any compensation. But after centuries of loss, A new chapter was about to be written. Not one of diminishment, but one of defiance. So what happens when a people who were meant to vanish simply refuse to disappear? On November 20th, 1969, a group of Native American activists landed on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. They didn't come as petitioners. They came as reclaimers. For 19 months, they held that island. They created a community there that drew international attention to a history America had desperately tried to forget. They invoked an 1868 treaty that allowed Native people to claim abandoned federal land. You see, their occupation wasn't an act of anarchy. It was a demand for promises to be kept. The occupation of Alcatraz became the spark. It galvanized the modern Native American rights movement. It influenced the passage of the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 and inspired a whole new generation to fight for sovereignty, for survival, and for the simple, undeniable truth of their own story. The treatment of Native peoples reveals a pattern of calculated suppression, but similar patterns would emerge in the corridors of political power itself. Section 3. Political Scandals and Presidential Cover-ups. The Oval Office has always projected an image of measured authority, but behind the press conferences and policy speeches, there have been moments of deliberate deception, documented corruption, and suppressed truths. These are 14 of them. Let's start with the systems, the quiet directives, and the loud public statements that made deception an institution. Right at the highest levels of American power. It's 1971. President Richard Nixon steps before the nation and declares a new kind of war. The war on drugs. To the public, it was framed as a vital crusade to fight a national menace. But years later, one of his top advisors, John Ehrlichman, revealed what was really going on. He admitted the whole thing was engineered to target two groups, the anti-war left and the black community. It was a political weapon, sold to the country as a public health campaign. Now, this was hardly the first time a major event was wrapped in layers of secrecy. Go back 8 years earlier, to 1963. A different chapter was being written, one that would cast a shadow over the country for decades. It's about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and the man they accused, Lee Harvey Oswald. You see, long before any shots were fired in Dallas, the Central Intelligence Agency had already compiled a massive file on Oswald. We're talking at least 1,400 pages of documents. They were watching him. They knew exactly who he was. And yet, for almost 60 years, parts of that file have remained secret. Even after multiple presidents ordered their release, some pages are still withheld today, hidden behind national security exemptions. It leaves this permanent question mark right at the very heart of the official story. Fast forward to the 1980s. The machinery of deception wasn't just hiding in intelligence files anymore. Now, it was driving secret foreign policy. The whole thing would eventually explode into a scandal we now call the Iran-Contra affair. The Reagan administration essentially built an illegal, off-the-books operation. Here's how it worked. First, they secretly sold weapons to Iran. Then, they took the profits from those sales and funneled them to anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. The problem? This was a direct violation of the Boland Amendment, a law passed by Congress specifically to forbid that exact kind of funding. 14 administration officials were indicted for their roles. 6 of them were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. You know, sometimes the deception isn't some complex winding scheme. Sometimes it's a single event, manufactured to sell a war. That's what happened in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was the justification for a massive escalation in Vietnam. The official story was that American ships had been hit by a second, unprovoked attack. But the declassified truth, confirmed by the NSA's own documents in 2005, is that the second attack almost certainly never happened. Still, the story led to a congressional resolution that plunged America deeper into a war that would ultimately kill more than 58,000 Americans. And that machinery of deceit? Well, it was also turned inward, against its own citizens. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran a secret program called SOINTLPRO. Officially, it was a counterintelligence program. Its real mission? To disrupt, discredit, and neutralize any domestic political groups the FBI considered subversive. And their targets included anti-war groups, the American Indian Movement, the Black Panther Party, and civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. In 1964, the FBI sent an anonymous letter to Dr. King. It included surveillance tapes of his private life, an act that was widely seen as a clear attempt to blackmail him into committing suicide. So much of this secret history, so many of these operations, you can trace them all back to a single foundational document written in secret right after World War II. It was called National Security Council Directive 10-2. Signed by President Truman, it gave the brand new CIA a secret mandate to conduct covert operations overseas. It authorized everything from propaganda to outright sabotage. This was the legal architecture for decades of secret interventions all around the world, from Iran to Guatemala and far beyond. But when this machinery of deceit runs for long enough, something happens. The truth starts to fight its way out. It comes out through whistleblowers, through investigations, and sometimes through the sheer weight of its own corruption. One of the earliest and maybe clearest examples of just pure high-level greed was the Teapot Dome scandal. This all went down during the administration of President Warren G. Harding. His Secretary of the Interior, a man named Albert Fall, secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies, and in return, he took home $404,000 in personal bribes, a fortune at the time. When the whole thing was exposed, Fall became the first cabinet member in U.S. history to be convicted of a felony committed while in office. 50 years later, another investigation would uncover secrets that were much, much darker than bribery. In 1975, a Senate committee led by Senator Frank Church began to pull back the curtain on America's intelligence agencies. And what the Church Committee found was shocking. It exposed that the CIA had been directly involved in assassination plots against at least 5 leaders of foreign countries. The committee documented no fewer than 8 separate attempts on the life of Cuba's Fidel Castro alone between 1960 and 1965. Just 4 years before the Church Committee, the truth was exposed not by Congress but by one man, Daniel Ellsberg. He leaked a top-secret study that the world would come to know as the Pentagon Papers. This was a 7,000-page document commissioned by the Secretary of Defense himself, and it proved in black and white that 4 U.S. presidents in a row had systematically lied to the American people about the Vietnam War. In private, they knew the war was failing, but in public they kept projecting confidence and sending more soldiers to fight. By the 21st century, the evidence of wrongdoing wasn't just confined to paper anymore. In 2004, a set of photographs from the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq leaked to the public. They showed the systematic abuse and torture of detainees by U.S. military personnel. In the end, 11 low-level soldiers were convicted, but the military's own internal report confirmed that the abuse stemmed from policy failures that reached much higher up the chain of command. Not a single senior military or civilian official was ever prosecuted. The accountability simply stopped at the bottom. When you look at all of this together, you realize that beyond the individual scandals, there's a deeper truth here. It's the existence of an unseen state, where power operates beyond public view, beyond accountability, and sometimes beyond the law itself. Sometimes the biggest secret of all is the one being kept inside the Oval Office. Back in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke. And for the next 17 months, the final stretch of his presidency, Wilson was almost completely incapacitated. His wife, Edith, and his doctor hid the truth from everyone. From Congress, from the cabinet, from the public. His wife effectively ran the country, screening every document and deciding what was important enough for the president to see. If the health of a president can be hidden from the nation, then so can an act of war by a city against its own people. In 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped a bomb from a helicopter onto a residential house, the headquarters of a group called MOVE. The fire that followed was catastrophic. It killed 11 people, 5 of them children. The city then let the fire burn, and it destroyed an entire city block. 65 family homes were just incinerated. A later investigation found that top city officials had authorized the bombing, yet no one ever faced criminal charges. Back in 1933, the unseen state nearly took the form of an actual coup. A highly decorated Marine Corps general, Smedley Butler, testified before Congress. He said he'd been recruited by a group of wealthy industrialists to lead a military coup to overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt. A congressional committee later confirmed parts of his story, but in the end, nobody was ever prosecuted. And in our modern era, the unseen state isn't just about secret deals or hidden plots. It's about data. In 2013, an NSA contractor named Edward Snowden leaked a trove of classified documents, and he revealed the true, breathtaking scope of global surveillance. Snowden's leaks proved that the National Security Agency was secretly vacuuming up the phone and internet data of millions of American citizens. The sheer scale of it went far beyond anything that had ever been disclosed to Congress. It was a global system, operating almost entirely outside of public knowledge. When you step back, you can see how it was all built, piece by piece, over decades. From the secret legal authority born in 1948, to the surveillance programs turned inward in the 50s, to the proof of sustained deception in the 70s, and finally to the technological reality of a global surveillance system revealed in our own time, the architecture of secrecy has deep foundations. It all leaves us with one final, unavoidable question. In a democracy, what is the real price of all this secrecy? And in the end, who is it that's really forced to pay? These political betrayals of public trust were not isolated to moments of crisis. They were woven into the very institutions Americans were taught to revere. Section 4. The hidden origins of American institutions. The buildings, badges, and founding documents that define American identity carry with them an origin story most citizens have never been told. Behind every institution lies a history of calculated decisions, many of which were never intended to see the light. Let's begin with the most fundamental element of a state: power. How was it established? How was it used? And how were its institutions built from the very beginning to maintain order and control? The official story points to Boston, 1838. That's where we're told America's first publicly funded police force was born. But in the South, the real roots of organized policing run much deeper and much darker. You have to go all the way back to the slave patrols, which were formalized in South Carolina as early as 1704. Their purpose wasn't public safety as we know it now. It was the enforcement of slavery, capturing runaways, crushing revolts, and terrorizing an entire population into submission. This single fraction is woven right into the DNA of a marriage and political power. The Three-Fifths Compromise of 1787. Well, it wasn't just some census calculation. It was an electoral weapon. By counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free one, it handed the slaveholding states enormous, disproportionate influence in Congress and in the Electoral College. And the results of that? For 32 of this nation's first 36 years, the presidency was held by a man from Virginia, the largest slaveholding state. 10,000. That's the number of so-called radicals, most of them immigrants, who were arrested during the Palmer raids between 1919 and 1920. Under the direction of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, federal agents conducted these massive sweeps across the country with almost no regard for due process. It was this vast overreach of state power that led to the birth of a new organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. For nearly half a century, 48 years, J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI like a personal intelligence empire. He kept secret files, dossiers on tens of thousands of American citizens, but he was most careful with the powerful. His confidential files held compromising information on every single president from Roosevelt to Nixon, on first ladies, on brilliant scientists, even on cultural icons. It was a library of secrets that made him one of the most feared and untouchable men in American history. An institution's power isn't just about who it controls. It's also about who it excludes. What we're looking at now are the systems that were designed to sort the population, to define who belongs, who gets to profit, and who is deliberately kept outside the walls of American prosperity. When the Constitution was ratified in 1788, it spoke of liberty, but it was completely silent on a universal right to vote. For generations, getting to the ballot box was restricted by property, by gender, and, of course, by race. It would take 132 years for women to get the vote nationally, and a staggering 177 years for the Voting Rights Act to finally secure meaningful access for Black Americans. The promise of democracy, it was put on hold for centuries. 18,000. That's the approximate number of indigenous individuals whose remains were held by just one institution, the Smithsonian. It was established in 1846, and over time it amassed one of the world's largest collections of Native American remains, often taken from burial sites without any consent. The Repatriation Act of 1990 ordered their return, but even today, decades later, that process is still hauntingly incomplete. In November of 1910, a secret meeting took place on Jekyll Island, Georgia. The guest list? Just 6 of the world's most powerful financiers, representing the Rockefeller, Morgan, and Warburg banking dynasties, along with 1 U.S. senator. In total secrecy, they drew up the blueprint for a central banking system. 3 years later, their plan became law. The Federal Reserve was born. You're about halfway through. If this has been worth your time, a like helps more people find it. That's all. After the Civil War, a new kind of forced labor took hold. It was called convict leasing. Southern states would lease out their prisoners, overwhelmingly black men, to private companies. In states like Alabama, this practice generated nearly 3/4 of all state revenue. It was quite simply slavery by another name. And the mortality rates in some of those camps? They exceeded 40%. There was nothing subtle about this policy. The Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 used national origin quotas to effectively slam the door on immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Asia, and from Africa. The authors were very clear about their goal: to maintain a Northern European Protestant majority. This single law fundamentally reshaped the ethnic makeup of the United States for the next 40 years. The last step in institutionalizing power is to make it invisible, to weave it so deeply into daily life that we forget its origins and its outcomes just feel natural. This is the architecture of normalcy. In 1877, Henry Ocean Flipper became the first black graduate of West Point. But his career didn't last long. Just 5 years later, he was court-martialed on questionable charges and dismissed from the Army. Justice, well, it took more than a century to arrive. It wasn't until 1999 that he was posthumously pardoned. His name finally cleared of a conviction that many believed was based entirely on racial prejudice. The GI Bill of 1944, it celebrated for creating the American middle class. But that prosperity wasn't shared by everyone. Because the benefits were handled locally, banks were free to discriminate. Think about this. In the suburbs of New York and northern New Jersey, out of the first 67,000 mortgages insured by the bill, fewer than 100 were given to non-white veterans. It was an engine of wealth for one group and a barrier for another. 62 years. That's how long it took for the promise of Brown versus Board of Education to finally be realized. The Supreme Court declared school segregation unconstitutional back in 1954. But it wasn't until a federal court order in 2016 that the very last school district in the country in Cleveland, Mississippi, finally fully desegregated. 62 years after that landmark ruling. Before the car, streets were public spaces meant for everyone. But as car accidents skyrocketed in the 1920s, the auto industry launched a massive campaign to redefine the street. They actually invented the concept of jaywalking and then lobbied cities to pass laws that criminalized pedestrians. What they did was shift the legal and moral blame for collisions away from the driver and onto the person on foot. From the 1930s all the way through the 1960s, the Federal Housing Administration simply refused to insure mortgages in neighborhoods where black or immigrant families lived. This practice, redlining, starved these communities of investment for decades. And the consequences? They're permanent. A recent study found that nearly 3/4 of the neighborhoods that were labeled hazardous 80 years ago are still low to moderate income communities today. You know, even our most common civic rituals have a hidden history. The Pledge of Allegiance, written back in 1892, was originally done with a specific salute. The right arm extended straight out toward the flag. By the early 1940s, the chilling resemblance of that gesture to the Nazi salute had become a serious problem. So in 1942, with America at war, Congress officially changed the protocol to the hand-over-heart gesture that we all know today. But the pledge would change one more time, just a decade later. In 1954, at the height of the Cold War and the Red Scare, Congress added 2 words, under God. Why? To draw a sharp line between the United States and the officially atheist Soviet Union, embedding a global political struggle into a daily classroom promise. These are the stories that were filed away, the ones deemed inconvenient. What they show us is that our institutions are not accidents of history. They are the products of choice, of power, of intent. And their foundations, once they were set, cast long, long shadows that reach all the way to this very day. The institutions Americans built were shaped by the pressures of power, and nowhere were those pressures more secretive than during the Cold War. Section 5. Cold War Secrets Hidden from the Public. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union waged a shadow war that extended far beyond missile silos and summits. Much of what happened during the Cold War was deliberately concealed from the American public. Classified, denied, or forgotten. You know, in the aftermath of one world war, the seeds of the next were already being sown, in secret. And the lines between ally and enemy, between right and wrong, they began to disappear. Our story starts in the ruins of the Third Reich. As the world was celebrating victory, American intelligence officers were quietly launching Operation Paperclip, a program really built on a foundation of moral compromise. The mission: recruit Germany's best scientific minds before the Soviets could get to them. And they did. Over 1,600 German scientists were brought to the United States. The problem was, many had documented ties to the Nazi regime. So, their records were sanitized. New dossiers were literally paperclipped over the old ones, to get around President Truman's direct order banning any Nazi affiliates. And just like that, the space race, well, it would be fueled by the very minds that built the V-2 rocket. This covert war soon spread to America's own backyard. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. The code name was PB Success. And the reason for the coup? It wasn't some fear of communism, no. It was to protect the interests of a corporation, the United Fruit Company, whose profits were threatened by Arbenz's land reforms. The result of that coup was a military government that plunged the nation into a brutal 36-year civil war. The death toll is estimated to have reached 200,000 people. That was the price of protecting corporate interests. While these shadow wars were being fought on the ground, a far more terrifying threat was looming over everyone. Between 1946 and 58, the United States detonated 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. The biggest test, Castle Bravo, had a yield of 15 megatons. To put that in perspective, that is 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. Islanders just 100 miles away were blanketed in radioactive fallout, and they weren't evacuated for 3 days. The Cold War wasn't just fought with weapons. It was a war for hearts and minds, and the battlefield? The American press. Through a program called Operation Mockingbird, the CIA secretly recruited American journalists to spread propaganda. The agency developed relationships with staff at major newspapers and wire services, effectively turning parts of the free press into a covert arm of the state. Then, in 1961, the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed something truly chilling, Operation Northwoods. This was a plan to stage false flag terrorist attacks on American soil just to create a pretext for invading Cuba. The proposal literally included bombing U.S. cities and hijacking commercial airplanes. It was presented to the Secretary of Defense, who thankfully rejected it. But the fact that it was conceived at all shows you just how thin the line between defense and deception had become. A year before the coup in Guatemala, the playbook had already been tested in Iran. In 1953, the US and Britain jointly orchestrated the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. His crime? He nationalized Iran's oil industry. The coup, codenamed TP Ajax, reinstated the Shah, whose authoritarian rule would then last for 26 years, right up until the Iranian Revolution. As this secret state grew, so did the cost, not just in dollars, but in human lives, and in the slow erosion of the very principles it claimed to be defending. This was the real price of power. During the so-called Forgotten War, the U.S. Air Force dropped more than 635,000 tons of bombs on North Korea. That is more than the total tonnage used in the entire Pacific theater during all of World War II. The scale of the destruction was almost total. General Curtis LeMay, the head of Strategic Air Command, would later estimate that the American bombing campaign killed approximately 20% of North Korea's population, 1/5 of the population. It's a devastating statistic and one that was largely absent from American history books for decades. The quest for intelligence reached almost unbelievable heights and depths. In 1974, Project Azorian was a covert CIA mission to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific. The cost was $800 million, that's nearly $5 billion in today's money, and its existence wasn't even acknowledged until 2010. In the jungles of Vietnam, the war became chemical. During Operation Ranch Hand, the U.S. military sprayed 20 million gallons of herbicides, most famously Agent Orange, to destroy the forest cover. An estimated 3 million Vietnamese people and tens of thousands of American veterans were exposed to its poison, leading to cancers and to birth defects that would haunt families for generations. You see, the entire architecture of the Cold War was designed in secret. Back in 1950, a classified document known as NSC-68 redefined the Soviet threat as an existential one. It called for a massive military buildup, tripling the defense budget and locking the nation into an aggressive posture that would define American foreign policy for the rest of the century. And that document? It remained classified until 1975. Eventually, the war abroad turned inward. Operation Chaos was an illegal domestic surveillance program run by the CIA. It compiled files on more than 7,000 American citizens who were involved in the anti-war movement. This was a direct violation of the CIA's own charter, which forbids it from operating domestically. The enemy, it seemed, was now its own people. In the final act of the Cold War, the greatest secrets weren't about spies or coups anymore. They were about the terrifying infrastructure of doomsday and the chilling moments when the world almost ended by mistake. In 1958, near Florence, South Carolina, the Cold War literally came home. An Air Force bomber accidentally dropped a Mark 15 nuclear bomb. Miraculously, the nuclear core didn't detonate, but the conventional explosives did, destroying a family's house and leaving a 75-foot crater in their yard. 6 people on the ground were injured. And for the family whose home was obliterated by an American nuclear weapon, the Air Force provided compensation, a grand total of just $54,000. While the public was practicing duck and cover drills under their school desks, the government was making other arrangements. Concealed beneath a luxury resort in West Virginia was the Greenbrier Bunker, a massive underground facility designed to house the entire U.S. Congress after a nuclear attack. Its existence remained a complete secret for over 30 years. It's easy to look back on the era and just call it paranoia. But it wasn't unfounded. The Venona Project, a top-secret army program, actually managed to decrypt Soviet communications from the 1940s. And the messages confirmed the government's worst fears. A widespread Soviet spy network had penetrated the State Department, the Treasury, and yes, even the Manhattan Project. The program itself remained one of America's most tightly guarded secrets until 1995. In November of 1983, NATO ran a war game called Able Archer. It simulated a nuclear first strike with such terrifying realism that the Soviet Union became convinced it was the real thing, a prelude to an actual attack. In response, the Kremlin placed its own nuclear forces on high alert, preparing to launch a retaliatory strike. For several tense days, the world stood, completely unknowingly, right on the precipice of annihilation. Historians would later conclude that, during Able Archer, the world came closer to all-out nuclear war than at almost any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A war started not by aggression but by a catastrophic misunderstanding, a secret, until it was almost too late. While governments played with fire on the world stage, corporations at home were making calculated decisions that put profits above the lives of ordinary Americans. Section 6. Corporate and Industrial Crimes Against the Public. You've now heard how governments and institutions operated behind closed doors. But some of the most consequential decisions in American history were not made in the White House or the Pentagon. They were made in boardrooms, and the cost was measured in lives. The boardrooms of American industry have, on more than one occasion, been the setting for decisions as consequential and as harmful as those made in government. The following facts document moments when corporate interests were placed above public safety, often with devastating results. Our story begins with the moments when corporations didn't just stumble into harm. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they chose not only to continue, but to actively, deliberately, conceal the truth. Back in 1962, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, uncovered the devastating environmental impact of the pesticide DDT. The chemical industry's response wasn't to address the science. No, it was to attack the scientist. They launched a massive public relations campaign, spending the equivalent of over $2.4 million today, all to discredit her work and protect their profits. Then there's the case of the Johns Manville Corporation, once the nation's largest asbestos manufacturer. For decades, the company knew its product caused a fatal lung disease. This wasn't a suspicion, it was a known fact, documented deep within their own internal files. The timeline here reveals a deliberate, decades-long deception. As far back as the 1930s, company memos confirmed the health risks. Yet for the next 40 years, as their own workers inhaled these deadly fibers, the truth was buried. It wasn't until 1982, facing an avalanche of over 16,000 lawsuits, that the company finally declared bankruptcy. For most of the 20th century, companies like General Motors and Standard Oil pushed leaded gasoline hard. They did this even though their own research, going all the way back to the 1920s, showed that lead was a powerful neurotoxin. The cumulative effect of that one decision is just staggering. Lead exposure from gasoline is now thought to have lowered the IQ of nearly every single American born before 1990. In December of 1984, the setting is a Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India. A catastrophic chemical leak sends a cloud of toxic gas drifting over the sleeping city. Thousands died almost immediately. Hundreds of thousands more were injured. It remains one of the worst industrial disasters the world has ever seen. Union Carbide, an American company, eventually reached a settlement with the Indian government for $470 million. But what did that number actually mean for the victims? Well, on average, it came out to roughly $500 per person for a lifetime of suffering. Now we turn from a single catastrophic event to a deception that unfolded over decades, affecting millions. The tobacco industry knew. Their own internal research, some of it from the 1950s, had already confirmed that cigarettes were addictive and they caused cancer. But in 1994, armed with that secret knowledge, the CEOs of 7 major tobacco companies stood before Congress and they swore an oath. That statement, from William Campbell of Philip Morris, was echoed by all 7 executives. It was a lie of truly historic proportions broadcast to the entire world. But a lie that big cannot hold forever. 4 years later, the Master Settlement Agreement forced the industry to pay $206 billion over 25 years. It was, and still is, the largest civil litigation settlement in U.S. history. In 2001, the energy giant Enron went from being the seventh largest company in America to bankrupt. The reason? Executives had been using complex accounting tricks to hide billions of dollars in debt, all to make the company look far more valuable than it was. And when that house of cards finally collapsed, more than 20,000 employees didn't just lose their jobs. Many of them lost their entire life savings. Sometimes, the deception isn't just about hiding a fact. It's about creating a new one. In the 1960s, the sugar industry secretly paid 3 Harvard scientists what would be about $50,000 today. Their job was to publish a piece of research that would shift the blame for heart disease away from sugar and onto saturated fat. For decades, that manufactured conclusion shaped America's official nutritional guidelines. For decades, the DuPont Chemical Company knowingly released a toxic compound called PFOA, a forever chemical, from its plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia, right into the local water supply. Internal documents proved the company was well aware of the health risks, including clear links to cancer. But for the community it employed, the company remained silent. So far, we've looked at what was hidden. But what happens when the harm isn't hidden at all? What happens when it's the direct result of a calculated disregard for human life? This brings us to the second part of our story: cases where corporate negligence, a systemic failure to prioritize even the most basic safety, led to absolute catastrophe. March 25, 1911. A fire breaks out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. The workers, mostly young immigrant women, rush to the exits, only to find them locked. Management had locked the doors to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks. 146 people died that day, trapped not just by a fire, but by a decision that valued minutes of labor over their lives. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched a revolutionary painkiller, OxyContin. Their marketing campaign was aggressive, and it was built on a single powerful claim: the risk of addiction was very low. What they didn't advertise was that they knew their drug's time-release formula could be easily defeated, making it dangerously addictive. The result of that marketing strategy was an opioid crisis that, by 2022, had contributed to the overdose deaths of more than 500,000 Americans. At Wells Fargo, a relentless, high-pressure sales culture pushed employees to meet quotas that were nearly impossible. So what did they do? They secretly opened millions of bank and credit card accounts in their customers' names, without permission, often racking up fees for products those customers never even knew they had. The scale of this fraud was just immense. It involved at least 3.5 million unauthorized accounts. It led to more than 5,300 employees being fired, and it ultimately cost the bank a $3 billion fine. Sometimes, corporate negligence can reshape the entire country. In the mid-20th century, a group of companies, including General Motors, Standard Oil, and Firestone, all conspired to buy up and then dismantle efficient electric streetcar systems in over 45 American cities. Their goal was simple: kill the competition to create a captive market for their buses, cars, and tires. The companies were eventually convicted of conspiracy to monopolize. And for fundamentally reshaping American cities for their own profit, the penalty for General Motors was just $5,000? We end our story here, at the Farmington mine disaster of 1968. An explosion ripped through a coal mine in West Virginia, and 78 miners never came out. The company had a long, documented history of safety violations. The tragedy was so profound, it finally forced Congress to pass the first real federal health and safety standards for mining. In the end, it was their deaths that mandated the protections that should have been there all along. It leaves you wondering, what other stories are still buried, waiting for their moment to be told? Where corporate negligence ended, mystery sometimes began. And there are chapters of American history for which no satisfactory explanation has ever been offered. Section 7. Unsolved Mysteries and Unexplained Historical Events. If you're still awake, what comes next is different from everything you've heard so far. These are not stories of cover-ups or corruption. These are stories that simply never resolved, and the open questions are what make them impossible to forget. Some stories in American history do not resolve neatly. They linger, not because of speculation or fabrication, but because the evidence itself remains incomplete, contradictory, or sealed. These final 16 facts occupy that uncomfortable space between what is known and what may never be. Now, what we're about to explore, this is something different. These aren't your typical stories of deliberate cover-ups or some grand conspiracy. No, these are the stories that just stopped, the files that are still open, the facts that exist in that uncomfortable space between what we know and what we might never find out. Some mysteries begin as a complete void, a total absence where a person or a place used to be, just a sudden, deafening silence in the historical record. Think about November 24, 1971. A man we only know as D.B. Cooper hijacks a plane, gets a hold of $200,000 in ransom money, and then parachutes out into the deep forests of Washington state. The FBI ran one of the longest investigations in its history, but they never found him, never even identified him. In 2016, they just closed the case. Or what about the ghost ship, the SS Arung Medan, from back in the 40s? Story goes it was found just adrift in the Strait of Malacca. When the rescue crew got on board, they found the entire crew dead, their faces frozen in pure terror. But here's the thing. No official registration for that ship has ever been located. The story itself is a ghost. On June 30, 1956, two airliners collided right over the Grand Canyon. 128 people were killed. The tragedy exposed a terrifying void in the system. Back then, huge swathes of American airspace were completely uncontrolled. That disaster is the direct reason we have the Federal Aviation Administration today, a system born from a catastrophic lack of oversight. In 1587, about 115 English colonists made a new home on Roanoke Island. 3 years later, when the supply ships came back, the whole settlement was gone. Everyone. The only clue they left behind was a single word carved into a post: Croton. Over 400 years later, it's still one of America's first and greatest mysteries. Now, other times, we know exactly what happened. The events are clear, but the people at the heart of the story, they remain phantoms. The mystery isn't what occurred, but who these people were and what on earth drove them. The outlaw Jesse James was shot and killed in 1882. End of story, right? Not even close. For decades, rumors churned that he had faked his own death. The question of his identity became so huge, such a piece of American folklore, that it took over a century and a DNA analysis in 1995 to finally prove the man in the grave was really him. In 1948, a body turns up on a beach in Australia. No identification. The only thing they find is a scrap of paper in his pocket that says, Tamam Shud. It's Persian for, it is finished. The case stayed cold for decades, until 2022, when DNA finally gave him a name, Carl Webb. So now we know who he was, but we still have absolutely no idea why he died. That very same year, an American journalist named George Polk was found dead in a bay in Greece, his hands and feet tied. He'd been investigating corruption. Now, a local guy was convicted, but many believe it was all a show trial, a cover-up for intelligence operatives. The identity of his Rayol killers? Still a state secret. In the winter of 1959, 9 Soviet hikers died under some of the most bizarre circumstances imaginable in the Ural Mountains. Soviet investigators couldn't explain their horrific injuries, so in the official report, they chalked it up to an unknown compelling force. It's one of the most chilling non-answers you'll ever hear. Sometimes, the mystery isn't about a lack of evidence. It's about a failure of the very institutions that are supposed to give us clarity. It's what happens when the system itself makes everything uncertain. When President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, his killer was executed in just 53 days. But the one big question, did he act alone, was never really answered. Why? Because the Secret Service destroyed most of its own files on the case, leaving a permanent shadow over the official story. In 1975, a 15-year-old girl, Martha Moxley, was murdered in Greenwich, Connecticut. It took 27 years to finally convict a suspect, but his conviction was later thrown out, and in 2020, all the charges were dropped. After 45 years of investigations and trials, the case is officially right back where it started, unsolved. When TWA Flight 800 exploded in 1996, 230 people were lost. The official investigation concluded it was an electrical spark, but that finding has never been reconciled with what over 250 eyewitnesses claim they saw, a streak of light heading up toward the plane just before it blew apart. July 30th, 1975. The powerful head of the Teamsters, Jimmy Hoffa, walks into a restaurant parking lot in Michigan and is never seen again. Declared legally dead in '82, decades of searching have turned up nothing. His disappearance remains one of the 20th century's most haunting, simple facts. In 1942, 8 Nazi saboteurs landed on American soil. They were captured and tried by a secret military tribunal. 6 were executed just weeks later. The sheer speed and secrecy of it all created a legal mystery, one whose precedent was cited decades later during the debates after 9/11. And finally, we have the masterpieces. The grand, unresolved enigmas that are so much a part of our culture, they feel less like history and more like modern myth. He terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s, taunting the police with cryptic letters. One of his ciphers was so complex, it took a team of amateur codebreakers 51 years to solve it. And to this day, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer has never been confirmed. On March 18, 1990, 2 men dressed as police officers walked into Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They walked out with 13 works of art, including masterpieces by Rembrandt and Vermeer. Value: $500 million. It's the largest unsolved art heist in history. And if you go to the museum today, you can still see the empty frames hanging on the walls. And then there's Roswell. In 1947, the U.S. military announces it has recovered a flying disc. Then, just as quickly, they retract it, saying it was just a weather balloon. Decades later, another new report claims the debris was from a secret spy program. These shifting official stories have fueled more than 75 years of debate and cemented an American myth. So what's the thread that connects a lost colony to an empty frame, a ghost ship to a secrets? These files may never close. They are the permanent questions, reminding all of us that the past isn't some settled place, and that sometimes the most honest answer is simply to say, we don't know. 101 facts. 101 moments when the official record diverged from what actually happened. None of what you heard tonight is speculation. Every program, every study, every document referenced in this video has been verified through declassified files, congressional testimony, or investigative reporting. What we call history is almost always a selection. Someone decided what belonged in the textbook and what didn't. What you heard tonight is what didn't make the cut. If you fell asleep somewhere in the middle, everything you missed is still here. Subscribe, and next week's documentary will find you. Sleep well.